This is a conversation with Mujtaba Rahman, someone who you would call an insider of European politics. He leads the European section of the Eurasia Group, and a big part of his job is to know what's going on behind the scenes. Not just what you can read in the news, but what European leaders really think, say, and do when there are no cameras in the room. And so it was a perfect opportunity to dive deep into European politics. We talked about whether Europe has a strategy for what to do with Ukraine and Russia, about what European leaders really think about Donald Trump behind closed doors, or how they are already preparing for post-US Europe, or how likely it is that anti-establishment politicians in Germany, France, and the UK could sweep through Europe in coming years, win elections, and completely turn things upside down. I think it's a fascinating conversation with someone who really knows what he's talking about. And if you want to get more high-quality, in-depth geopolitical analysis, and for free, to help filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, you can sign up to my newsletter. There, I break down the big-picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns that actually matter, and try to provide real signal and real intelligence. You can find the link in the description. And as a reminder, the corporate partner of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about European politics, naturally, and there's a lot of things that I want to talk about. I'd like to zoom in on the national level. But before that, I'd like to start with the big picture and the international level and how European countries are able or not able to deal with issues that are too big for any of them to deal with individually. And as a case study of whether Europe can do that, I think it makes sense to use the biggest issue that Europe is dealing with at the moment, which is obviously the Ukraine war and Russia. And specifically everything that has been happening since Donald Trump returned to the White House. And the angle that I'd like to look at is that when Donald Trump returned and he and J.D. Vance started to take a pretty aggressive stance against Ukraine and against Europe in general, there was a lot of talk about Europe needing to wake up and step up and start acting like a serious geopolitical player. And there's a lot of talk about that this is the moment when it's finally going to happen and when Europe is finally going to start to take responsibility for itself. And now we've had a few months to look at what has been actually happening. So do you think that those expectations were correct? And do you think that this waking up and stepping up to the plate, do you think that it actually happened?
So, great question. I will put my remarks into context. I think there is a sense now across all European capitals, most European capitals, certainly in Brussels, that the administration the Europeans are now dealing with is a predatory regime. The goal of the administration is to destabilize Europe. When the administration speaks to its allies within the EU, they are talking to the Orbáns and the Fizzos and the AfD and Le Pen. And if destabilization is not the active goal of the administration, as it seeks to do the things it wants to do, which is focus on China, the Indo-Pacific, rewrite the rules of the global trading system, whatever those goals may be, the byproduct of those goals is destructive and destabilizing for the EU. So whether the goal is destabilization or whether destabilization is the byproduct, that is the consequence of this administration, and the Europeans need to organize themselves around that. Now, I do think there is a recognition of the need for Europe to organize in response to what we're seeing from the US. That Rubicon has been crossed. In many countries that have been reluctant to engage or accept that reality because of their historical ties to or dependence on America, primarily for their security. And I think a really good example of this is Germany, where we have a transatlantic chancellor in the form of Friedrich Merz, who has come in and completely rewired the fiscal framework that will enable the country to do things that were unimaginable even 6 months ago, and who's talking about the new world that we're in terms that would also have been unimaginable 6 months ago, about the need for European sovereignty, about the need to work with the French on their extended nuclear deterrence, on the fact one cannot rely on the transatlantic alliance and the US administration in the way historical governments have done. And so I do think mentally, starting with JD Vance at the Munich Security Conference, running through Zelensky's humiliation in the Oval Office, running through Liberation Day and the mess on tariffs, that message has landed. And member states and the institutions in Brussels now clearly understand that they need to organize a credible response to their own security and defense, that they need to adopt a completely different posture with respect to trade. They need to champion and get a deal with Canada over the line. They need to do more with Mercosur, and they need to step up and take more responsibility for Ukraine. So it's too early, to my mind, to assess whether kind of Europe's efforts to date are credible enough. But I do think the recognition that Europe needs to do more is clearly there. And we're now beginning to see, I think, movement on the policy side. So discussions in Brussels about more fiscal support for Ukraine, the need to step up and do more for our own security and defense, the fact that we're building in real time a common European and security policy. No, that I think we'll happy to talk more about this, but there'll be a big discussion on that at the European Council in June before the NATO summit, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think there's a recognition of the context, there's a recognition of the administration and the challenges that presents, and there is a willingness to do things that I think were previously unimaginable. But we're at the beginning of that process. Some people will say this reality has been obvious for a long time, and so why hasn't Europe already moved? And my response to that is, it's very hard for governments to prepare policy on the basis of these extreme downside scenarios. It's even harder for individual governments to do that, but then for 27 governments and the institutions in Brussels to develop a policy response to that kind of world. It always happens in response to, not the potential of. And now I think we are seeing enough. And so I think the policy response is one that will now be forthcoming. I would say a final point I'll make on this, Dominic, is you've seen in response to previous crises, and this is not to be lazy and path dependent, but I do think it's important to say and be clear that in response to external crises, Europe does have and has demonstrated the capacity to act and do things very, very quickly when under pressure. And so my own sense, having covered European politics this closely at Eurasia Group for 15 years, is there is an inbuilt resilience within the EU that outside observers typically tend to underestimate and underappreciate. And we've seen that resilience manifest in response to Greece and its financial troubles. That was existential for the euro. We saw it again in response to Brexit. We've seen it in response to the COVID pandemic. And I think there's a similar set of external challenges the bloc is confronting now. And I think it would be naive and silly to underestimate the capacity and the resilience of these member state governments and institutions to develop an appropriate policy response. It doesn't look clean. It's always a bit messy. It takes time to do. But the ultimate outcome is a Europe that is likely to prove to be more coherent and stronger, I guess, for the result than at the start of the crisis compared to where we'll be at the end.
And it does seem, and I don't want to be overly optimistic here or too flattering for the European leadership, but it does seem that with every crisis and the more crises we have, we tend to get a little better at dealing with them and handling them together.
I think that's right. Because in response to each crisis, a policy is iterated or developed or integrated that can then be used as the basis for a future crisis. And a good example here is okay, Europe is struggling now on this question of fiscal space at the national level. Some countries are trying to ramp up their defense spending. They don't have the fiscal capacity to do it. Italy's a good example. France is a good example. Germany obviously does have the fiscal space to do it and now will rearm in a very aggressive way over the course of the next 0 to 5 years. What can be done at the European level to enable the rearmament of Europe as a whole, collectively, not just for countries that have the fiscal space to do so? And that's where we begin to talk about collective defense. It's where we begin to talk about next generation EU, the policy toolkit that was used to address the economic fallout from the COVID pandemic. Is there something similar that one can do now to enable the countries that don't have the fiscal space to rearm but need to do so? That's a debate that is ongoing. I think will certainly come to a head, maybe not at the June European Council, maybe afterwards. But again, we look at what happened in COVID and it does provide the basis or the template for thinking through what the future response to the crisis the Europeans are currently confronted with may look like.
I thought it was so interesting, and I think it's so interesting that you can offer the more of an insider view when you said how the European governments, I guess not all of them, but many of them view the American administration, and that it sounds like they don't have that many illusions about how it treats Europe or how it sees Europe. But I think that looking at it from the outside, and that's why it's quite surprising what you're saying, looking at it from the outside, you wouldn't necessarily say that, because it seems to me that European leaders have been very quiet on this and very, very careful in what they say publicly against Donald Trump. And I understand that strategy, but in some issues, like for example, on the issue of Greenland, I do find it very surprising that no one has really came out against that and stood behind Denmark and Greenland in something that does seem like a pretty fundamental for Europe as a whole.
I mean, as you've said, I think you've explained the reason. I mean, this is the real world, right? This is not science fiction. Ultimately, governments need to figure out a way, a modus vivendi, to get on and in a groove with the Trump administration. Starmer gets a huge amount of criticism for this, but the US is absolutely critical and central to UK national security. Trump, with one kind of determination on policy on tariffs, could completely blow up and destroy Rachel Reeves's entire fiscal strategy and the government's entire economic plan. I think if they were to in a very disorderly way disengage and withdraw from NATO, the consequences for our posture against the Russians would be existential. Same for Ukraine. I mean, there is no choice but to work with the Trump administration, and that is, of course, guiding policy, while at the same time actively preparing for a world where America is withdrawing and destabilizing. But one can, chew gum and walk at the same time, and that's what member state governments are doing. I think the Macron view of this, and I agree with this view, is we've got to engage the Americans in a productive and a constructive way. That also has the benefit of creating space and opportunity for us to do the work we need to do to make sure we're in a position to be ready for a world where, there will be less America involved in the European theater. Kind of being outright kind of hostile to the administration or taking on the administration doesn't serve those goals. It's not in anyone's interest. And so there is a softly approach that countries are necessarily going to take towards the administration. But in private, of course, I think everyone is absolutely clear about what they're seeing, about the nature of the regime, about the things the US administration is doing domestically with respect to the rule of law, with respect to minorities, what they're doing with respect to Russia and Ukraine. Today, I think absolutely siding more on the side of Putin, the aggressor in the conflict, not throwing Zelensky and Ukraine under the bus, but certainly putting a lot more pressure on the weaker partner. And there is outright hostility towards the EU and what it represents. Trump hates the EU. That's not lost on anybody. Does it make sense to engage in a public rhetorical fight with the administration. Absolutely not. And so I don't think anybody's under any illusions about what they see and about the risks that the administration presents. But the policy response is still the same. Engage the administration in a productive way that creates space for us to do the work we need to do to make sure we're in a position to address the world that we're confronted by more effectively over the medium term than we are today. And that, to my mind, is the right approach.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. Yeah, I guess that's what diplomacy is all about in the end. Maybe to get back to Ukraine for a little bit, I do wonder if you think, and you were explaining how things are changing and how they're definitely different than they were, but I do wonder if you think that Europe as a whole have sort of a strategy or a vision for how to deal with the Ukraine war, how to deal with Russia of its own, because it does seem that we tend to get quite angry at what Trump is doing or not doing, or that he should be doing more. But it doesn't seem like that Europe sort of has its own plan that it's acting on or trying to take a lead. And maybe to lump another question into that, it seems that the only visible initiative that we have in Europe is the sort of French-led coalition of the willing group. That would be theoretically willing to send soldiers to Ukraine as peacekeepers. But to me, that seems like it almost demonstrates sort of a detachment from reality, because that's preparing for some future scenario that is not here and might never actually happen. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I don't agree with that view at all, actually. I think, so first thing I would say is I think the European response to Ukraine has been very robust. I don't know I think we're on the 16th or the 17th, maybe even the 18th sanctions package. We are continuing to turn the screws on the Putin regime and ensure the sanctions regime is effectively implemented, that the ways in which Putin is attempting to evade the sanctions regime, his ability to do that is further constrained. So we continue to implement and reinforce and tighten sanctions against the Putin regime. The Union has been doing that clearly. There is a membership path for Ukraine over the medium term that will be absolutely key for its future and its reconstruction prospects. On the fiscal side, Europe has been a strong fiscal champion and supporter for Ukraine. I see absolutely no concern at all about the need to provide more fiscal support for Ukraine in the event that they need to do it. If in the event they need to do so, there's a question about the kind of aid the Ukrainians need and whether the Europeans have the industrial military capacity to produce the kind of stuff Ukraine needs in the event the Americans fully disengage or taper their support. But that's more a kind of technical question around production capacity and investment than it is political appetite to support Ukraine. So I think political support for Ukraine has been incredibly robust on sanctions, on the membership perspective, on fiscal support. And now, I think it's wrong when people look at the need for 27 unity on the Ukraine question, on the question of what to do now with the Trump administration. There are a few countries that have strategic capacity and culture in Europe. They're the countries that are leaning in on the Ukraine plan, and that's the E3 plus the institutions in Brussels, and that's who you need. You don't need Spain or Portugal. No offense to Spain or Portugal on this question, but they're irrelevant. They don't have agency. You do need the French, you do need the Brits, you do need Poland, you do need Germany, and you need the institutions, and you have those countries. Actually, Europe has been very effective at quickly coalescing around a format that is relevant for Ukraine and convening the relevant people with agency on this question to think through the implications of what the administration is doing for Ukraine. And so I think it is the relevant players in the room at the right time, thinking through a plan for Ukraine. you don't need a European Council on this, because 2/3 of the countries are irrelevant to the question of the, are irrelevant to the question that Ukraine is now grappling with, which is how to secure, in the first instance, a ceasefire that's durable, and in the second instance, use that durable ceasefire as the basis for a more substantive negotiation over the peace. And for those two bits, you need the countries that are engaged in an intergovernmental way that Starmer and Macron have been leading. And so I think there is a plan. The plan is a ceasefire that holds, and putting pressure on Putin to agree to a ceasefire that he is reluctant to agree to, and to influence and push the American administration to put more pressure on Putin to agree to the ceasefire. And then, and only after a ceasefire is holding, to negotiate on the substance of territorial concessions, the questions around reconstruction, questions around how to use frozen assets to support that reconstruction effort, questions around NATO membership, and if not membership of NATO, then very, very credible and robust guarantees, and so on and so forth. And so I think there is a credible, plan and effort that the Europeans are engaging the American administration on, and engaging the Ukrainians with. And at the moment, part of the reason you're not seeing, we've not seen Trump walk away, and we're not seeing a bad peace come together on Russia's terms, is because European support for Ukraine is so robust. So, when Trump comes out and says, we're going to do a peace deal, and the peace deal involves de jure recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea, but also territories in eastern Ukraine that are not fully under Russian control, the Ukrainian reaction to that and the European reaction to that is absolutely clear. In private, there is a recognition that Ukraine is unlikely to get back all of its territory, whether pre-2022 or pre-2014. But there's also a recognition that setting a precedent by de jure recognition is a very, very bad thing to do. And so I think there is now E3 support for Ukraine adjusting and working on the plan or the proposal the Americans put on the table, but effectively saying no to that plan, presenting an alternative proposal. But again, that this needs to be sequenced correctly. It's only after a ceasefire has been achieved. Putin has no interest in a ceasefire. I think, all the military experts that we're engaging with are of the view the Russians are going to launch an offensive in the summer. Depending on how effective or successful that offensive is, may alter Putin's incentives to do a deal later in the year. So as we get into Q3 or Q4, at the moment, Witkoff's problem as he shuttles between Washington and Moscow is, as he looks to secure a deal with Putin that transgresses European and Ukrainian red lines, he can't do that deal without European and Ukrainian support, and there is no Ukrainian or European support for that kind of agreement. And of course, if the Americans then lean into Ukrainian preferences, they transgress Russian red lines, and I suspect that dynamic is going to continue for some time, which is why we're not seeing any progress. So kind of my sense is the historical support for Ukraine. We need to give more credit to Europe for what they've done so far. They could have, of course, done more, but what they have done has been fairly impressive, given the early sense in 2022, which was there would be no European support, and that there wouldn't even be appetite to implement sector sanctions, let alone freeze Russia's frozen assets in Euroclear and elsewhere. So they have done a fair amount. I think you do have the relevant countries that are now engaged with the administration and the Ukrainians in putting together a credible peace. I do think it is very clearly understood in Europe that a bad deal for Ukraine is not only terrible for Ukraine and ultimately existential for Ukraine, but also existential for Europe. That is clearly understood, which is why I think, my sense, certainly across the key member states that are relevant and have agency, support for Ukraine will remain robust as we move through this period with the US administration and see what they attempt to do.
You've mentioned that one of the, and I agree, and I think that's an underappreciated factor, and I guess that Europe is able to influence things even though it's not technically sitting at the negotiating table, but it still has influence. But one of the things that you've mentioned is that Europe has a plan for EU membership for Ukraine. And that would be, even though it's not much talked about, it would be a really big deal, and it would have a lot of consequences for Europe and for Ukraine in a number of areas. And listening to European representatives, it sounds like it's pretty much a done deal and that it will happen very, very fast. What's your view based on what you're hearing? Do you think that it is a done deal and it could happen as fast as is being mentioned? And do you think there are there it could be a lot more difficult than maybe people expect?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. I think there's top line political commitment to the um, goal of Ukrainian membership of the EU. I think that's von der Leyen has tied her legacy. Macron, to some extent, has tied his legacy to the Ukraine question. And so longer term, I think there is a trajectory there for Ukraine, and which parts of Ukraine we're talking about, of course, remains an open question depending on how things develop in the short to medium term with the US administration, the negotiations, etc. But, for rump Ukraine, if I can put it that way, to be a member of the EU, I think there is a top line political commitment within, not from Orban, except that, maybe not from Simeon. If George Simeon wins the Romanian presidential election on the 18th of May, maybe not from Romania, maybe not from Le Pen. So there are political questions within Europe about the durability of the approach that leaders have currently articulated, which is to stand behind this effort and to advance and move it forward. But of course, there are huge hurdles to get through. I mean, I've just talked about three very quickly. Elections in member states are going to be absolutely key. And if one of those elections in a big country throws up a populist leader that has a different disposition, the entire process can be derailed. It's unanimity. And so there will be major political hurdles on this path Ukraine now is on regarding accession. There are also going to be fiscal and financial questions that are super difficult. Ukraine is an agricultural superpower. If it joins the Union, the consequences for agricultural policy, the consequences for cohesion policy are going to be absolutely massive. I imagine Ukraine will need to join, and there will be very strong safeguards that are introduced in transition periods that ensure incumbent countries don't lose the subsidies that they currently receive, and which are a key part of, from voters' perspectives, benefits of membership, because these subsidies ultimately support, certainly on the cohesion side, economic development over the medium term. So there's going to be a question around retooling the EU budget, about making it much more fit for purpose in a world where Ukraine is a member state. And all of those questions, it's not just fiscal and financial, there are governance questions. All of those issues will need to be worked out. They all work on the basis of unanimity. And so they're complicated and they're longer term. But notwithstanding that, I think top line political commitment that Ukraine's future is a European one is there. And we've seen the European Council hang together on that question to date. And I suspect, Ukraine and Zelensky is not going to get everything he wants. That's the sad reality of the world where we're in. And to sell to his voters, ultimately, I suspect what will be concessions on territory, he will need to have in his pocket very credible guarantees regarding security to be, clear that Russia cannot do again what it has done in Feb 2022. And he will need, I think, a credible pathway to European membership. That will be one of the things he can sell to his electorate, as he has to do things that are quite unpalatable. And so I think the EU anchor is going to be really important, and it's going to be a selling point and an important selling point for him. So, but of course, there will be challenges as Ukraine moves through that path.
And there theoretically, that's also not really much talked about, but theoretically, there are some security guarantees for EU membership as well, right? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.